So 4 years ago today, the incomparable Stephen Sondheim dropped his body. He left this lifetime. And for any theater kid, classical musician, musical theater practitioner or aficionado, or just lover of great language, music, and art, it was quite a heavy loss that many of us processed. I felt like I sat Shiva for about 2 years for the man. But even in just like the month after, it was definitely quite an extended time of melancholy for me, for someone whom I never formally met. I actually came close on two occasions, but never actually met him. And yet I felt his presence, what his work represented in my life, and who he was actually beyond just like his work. It's baked into so many of my best memories and like ongoing joy because I cannot listen to a soundtrack or a recording of his work and not find some new lyrical play on words or double entendre or line that I never caught before, or some musical motif or leitmotif that I am like floored by the sophistication of it and whatnot. It's been 4 years, and I am certainly not the only person who feels this way. It's almost like a little ubiquitous to even be talking about him in this way because I think we have run out of superlative adjectives to describe him. I would sometimes describe him to people who weren't familiar as like a combination of Shakespeare, Mozart, and Bernstein, in the sense of like, he had the linguistic ability of Shakespeare and this like deep, trenchant insight into humanity. He had this musicality and ability to dramatize things musically like Mozart did. And with Bernstein, he was not only kind of this man of the theater and a man who thought about high end, even though he didn't believe in high and low, high-end American theater could essentially function as American opera because the limitations of the English language when set to music really prevent it from being or having a great traditional operatic tradition. I would say even more than Bernstein in a certain way, or maybe not more, but as much as Bernstein with his major works, Candide and West Side Story, being performed in international opera houses. Sondheim's works are performed probably more than a lot of other traditional American operas. Certainly Sweeney Todd, certainly A Little Night Music and Passion, things like that. So, and it's funny because he died, I believe, the day after Thanksgiving. And I remember the morning of Thanksgiving, I was at my family's home and we were packing up to go to the family mountain house. So we were going to enjoy dinner that evening. For some reason, I came across the liner notes that morning, just rushing through like old stuff in my childhood bedroom, the liner notes from A Little Night Music. And I didn't have time to really look at it or think much on it, but for some reason, it passed through my head that Steven's got to be 90 something now. Like, wow, like, he's not going to be around forever. And like I just had this kind of fleeting thought, I'm going to be so sad when he dies someday. And then, that was Thanksgiving. And literally the next day, my father said something. He's like, Holly, did you hear? He was watching the news and he said, did you hear Stephen Sondheim died? And I was like, no, he's been totally healthy. What are you talking about? And then, of course, I went and I watched and I saw that he had dropped his body. I've had that before a few times where I've had a premonition about someone or they've come into my consciousness and, they've either died or something else has happened. That, then kind of formally marked off like just so much, public adulation and all of these homages to him. I think, most beautifully was, I can't remember if it was Lin-Manuel Miranda or Shana Taub or somebody in the Broadway community organized this like big singing of his song Sunday on the Sunday after his death in Times Square. And it was much like a church or religious experience. I couldn't go because I was still away, but I love watching the clips and you can see them. They're on the internet somewhere. It was Stephen's music and that so compelled me, but it was also who he was because he didn't have, he had a charmed life and then he won, every award and he was, so suave and educated and brilliant and good looking and all of these things. But he didn't have it easy when it came to the most fundamental relationship in his life, which is his mother. He was born in New York City, but his parents separated when he was fairly young. And she actually moved him out to where I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where, he was fortunate to find through friends from school the greatest mentor and ultimate father figure in his life, Oscar Hammerstein. Oscar Hammerstein of Rodgers and Hammerstein fame, Sound of Music, Carousel, Oklahoma, great lyricist and librettist, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. And Stephen was good friends with Oscar's children from school. And he really ended up spending a lot of time at the Hammerstein farm in Doylestown. He just talked with reverence for Oscar. And Oscar gave him a very specific curricula when he was in high school. He said, if you want to be a playwright, here are the things you have to do. And he said, you have to adapt a play to be a musical, and then a book to be a musical, and then an original idea. And there was one other thing. And it was basically to wean him off of being able to just to adapt and set things, theatrically, to having his own ideas and then expressing them in the form of a musical. Oscar continued to be such an advocate for him personally and professionally throughout his life. And Stephen, while he says there's maybe a hint of, or he did say that there was like maybe a hint of exaggeration in this statement, he said it's really not far off that if Oscar had been a geologist, he would have been a geologist. Because it really, as much as he had obviously the proclivity for music and writing, it wasn't that he was trying to emulate about Oscar, who he just so loved who he was. And Oscar was a great humanitarian in his own right. We could talk about that. He was, lyrically, the way he expressed himself, far more simple than what we have come to know as the Sondheim style. Sondheim, who was so sardonic and witty and kind of detached and could be a little bit emotionally cool at times, but was very kind of cynical and funny and urbane. Oscar was the man who gave us, oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. And he's always talking about birds chirping and, seemingly simple. And people kind of want to dismiss him as a simpleton. But when you really get more deeply into the context in which he was writing, and he was writing 20 years earlier than Stephen was, he was actually quite a progressive in terms of, his social views and his just humanistic outlook. And, he didn't necessarily consider himself a formally religious man, but he did believe in this kind of like almost transcendental, I wouldn't think he would use that word, but this like unity of man that he was constantly trying to express in his and Roger's work. Really tried to, by honing in on specific kind of oversights in the social system, tried to kind of create more unity and connection by showing little breakdowns in the social fabric. I actually went to a concert which was focusing on Hammerstein's work as a lyricist a year ago. I didn't realize this, but apparently at soccer matches in Europe, they play You'll Never Walk Alone, and like grown men cry hearing this song because it's such like an anthem for connection and interconnectivity of all consciousness. If you want to look at it from that lens, through this like very, I wouldn't say bombastic, but big old ballad. But back to Stephen Sondheim, he grew, with Oscar as his mentor and his father figure. And I would always remember driving by the farm where the Hammerstein farm is. It's being turned into a beautiful museum now. And there's a national, landmarker that says, one of the most famous apprenticeships in American history happened here. And it mentions Stephen and Oscar. And, as a theater kid, as a kid who loved music growing up, I'd always like register that. But I think it's only really once I became a young adult and with each subsequent year that I got more and more kind of dew-eyed when I pass that place when I'm back visiting family because of what both of them mean to me. But even more than that, with that relationship of mentee to and mentor, what that represents. I've had many great mentors in my life, but I think I always craved for something that was maybe a little bit more day to day. And there's also something about, even though it's so different than my own experience as an adopted child, knowing that while Stephen's father was still in the picture, he didn't get to see him regularly. And so there was this alienation too from his mother who was just always very critical of him, and that he found this like deep love and this truly father figure in Oscar. And yet it was not because of, Eddie Bloodbind. It was a choice that both of them made, that especially Oscar as the adult in the situation, that like love is not just a biological compulsion, that it is as much a choice to give fully and freely to whomever shows up in your life. And so I've always been very, very deeply compelled and moved by that. Going back to Stephen's passing, when he died, like many people, I found myself immersing myself in his work, just listening to all of the soundtracks, both well-known and obscure, all the recordings, all the interviews. And I found myself, there's a 2-part series he released towards the end of his life. The first part is called Finishing the Hat. And then Look, I Made a Hat. This is the second half. And it's a reflection on his collected lyrics. And, again, he was just such a a deep thinker and a wonderful thinker. Beyond the brilliance of the lyrics, all of the backstage anecdotes and the deeply reflective, memoir is absolutely just, it's gold. It's gold. But I found myself, it was kind of like the page I opened up to seemingly. And it's a part where he is reflecting on his the beginning and the ultimate results of his collaboration with his second major collaborator in his lifetime, which was James Lapine, who, the first part of his career, a lot of his major works, which were all critical successes, not always commercial successes, but commercially successful enough, but major critical darlings were with the famous producer and director Hal Prince. And then in the 80s, he started working with James Lapine, who had a very different way of working, who was of a different generation, who was maybe a little bit into kind of the emotional, not simplicity of his characters, but directness. Whereas, with a lot of the Hal Prince, Stephen Sondheim pieces, you get these kinds of urbane, slightly disaffected, very self-aware and pontificating characters, whether it's like Company or a little night music or even in Sweeney Todd to a certain extent. And so he is reflecting about what the experience of working with James was like. And he ultimately brings it back to not just his formalistic changes in his writing, but how it changed him as a human. And for reasons we can get into, it quite moved me. So speaking about James and working with him, I found myself writing with more formal looseness than I had before, allowing songs to become fragmentary, like musicalized snatches of dialogue, but avoiding the static verbosity of recitative. I worried less about punctuating the piece with applause and concentrated more on the flow of the story itself. Even more noticeable was the effect of my new partnership on the tone of the work. I've often been accused of writing cold scores, intellectually acute but emotionally dispassionate, not user-friendly. Warmth comes in many guises, however, and one man's passion is another man's sentimentality. When I look back as objectively as I can at the shows I wrote before James and contrast them with Sunday in the Park with George and the others I wrote with him, it seems clear to me that a quality of detachment suffuses the first set, whereas a current of vulnerability, of longing, informs the second. It's not that I prefer one to the other, but at this late date, I can more easily understand the early and persistent reaction to my songs, although I'm glad to say the persistence seems to be wearing down with the passage of time. With James, detachment was replaced by a measure of compassion. When I think of songs like Sunday or Move On or No One Is Alone from Into the Woods, I realize that by having to express the straightforward, the unembarrassed goodness of James's characters, I discovered the Hammerstein in myself, and I was the better for it. I think it's interesting on an artistic level, coming back to his mentor. But for me personally, it was also such a beautiful distillation of, for those of us who are language people, for those of us who sometimes can be described as, eloquent and articulate, but can also hide behind the guise of well-crafted language, to find the Hammerstein and to be unafraid, to be unabashed, to be simple, to be direct. I'm good at it in some certain places where maybe the stakes are low, and I'm really not great at it in other places in my life. And to see him being so honest about it and to be recognizing what working with a very different collaborator could bring out of him, I felt seen and I felt hopeful for, could be for myself as well. So on this day, we celebrate, we mourn, but we really mostly celebrate the consciousness, the great, big, giant consciousness that was Stephen Sondheim.